adaptation, the application of Marxism in the late 20th century and the start of this century to update it, to keep it fresh, for its capacity to be able to relate. And of course, one of Chris's main contributions was to develop the arguments about Eastern Europe. And I think Alex Kalinikov made the point in his obituary in this week's Socialist Worker that Chris anticipated the resistance to Stalinism by workers in those countries. And of course the most important movement was the Solidarity movement, Solidarność in Poland, that took off in the late 70s and the early 80s. And if you look back at what Chris wrote, not only did he predict some kind of development like that, he also predicted that unless a revolutionary socialist current, very hard to do, because by definition, if you operate in a communist society with a capital C, which of course we describe as state capitalists, but they describe themselves as communists and use the language of Marxism to oppress the workers, it's phenomenally hard to develop Marxist arguments, and it did prove to be very hard. But the argument was, unless you do that, the most militant workers' movement in the world, and the Solidarity movement, was incredibly impressive. I mean, they really were. It was a mass movement. They occupied famously the shipyards, factories, and it looked like an insurrectionary workers' movement, and it was an insurrectionary workers' movement, but it didn't have a socialist leadership. It didn't have any, well, if you remember Lech Walesa, effectively collapsed into the Catholic Church. And very rapidly it transformed into, very best, a social democratic kind of version of our own Labour Party, and of course ended up half supporting Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. And the prediction there was exactly the failure. It was not possible to do it. Objectively, it was impossible looking back. But I mean, Chris's great contribution was to provide the analysis, both for the strengths, but also to warn us that to get where they wanted to go with that movement was going to be very, very hard. Okay, now we're into the 1980s. I want just to touch on Chris's editorship of the Socialist Worker in the early 1980s. Chris had joined the Socialist Worker editorial team in the early 1970s. When I talk about selling the paper in the early 1970s, of course it was a phenomenally brilliant paper. It was a tremendous editorial team. It was Paul Foote, Laurie Finn. People may remember Laurie. Paul sadly died also quite recently. So it was a great paper, but also it was a great paper partly because the class struggle was so high. It is actually easier to produce a good socialist paper when there's a high level of class struggle. It's very hard to produce a good socialist paper when the class struggle collapsed. And that's what Chris had to do. In the early 1980s, Chris had to produce a paper when what Tony Cliff described of the downturn was absolutely deepening. There had been a huge rise in the movement. That movement, more or less, it began to falter and collapse in the late 1970s, partly as a result of the Labour government coming back in 1974-75 and putting a dampener on the movement, capturing the trade union leaders, who in turn then kind of blocked the shop stewards movement, and the thing began to disintegrate, plus of course with rising unemployment. In any event, the 1980s, people will recall, is the decade of Margaret Thatcher and all that entailed, incredibly depressing politically. A lot of my generation and everyone in the room roughly of my age will report this. Most of our friends and comrades dropped out. I'm not going to make a moralistic point. It's just the pressure. Chris actually coined the phrase a crisis of militancy. There is a kind of shelf life. If you're going up with the movement over a long period of time, 10 years plus, and the thing falters and goes backwards, and you're getting older, you started a family, you've got a job, you've got to keep your job and so on, there's absolutely no question. It's a tremendous psychological pressure to become more passive, to become more inert. And we're not being moralistic. Lots of people didn't change their ideas. It's inevitably got enmeshed outside politics for some time. Chris edited the paper during that period. What did he have to do? He had to hang on to the core ideas. And the core ideas are under tremendous pressure. Marxism seemed to be a complete failure. After all, the so-called Marxist societies were visibly disintegrating, leading to the collapse of the Berlin Wall at the end of the decade. Thatcher had boasted, overplayed her hand in terms of winning working class support, but she did get some working class votes. She did, that selling the council houses was quite popular. Selling off British Gas and persuading people to buy shares in privatised gas. There was a degree of support in the working class. More important, of course, Labour seriously let workers down. Seriously let working class people down in the late 70s. And on top of that, just to make it even more complicated, Tony Benn, who's become in our eyes this generation a very, very plausible and serious leader of the Stop the War movement and a really asset to the left, in those days, in the early 80s, was a serious competitor for us. Because Ben made a bid for my generation, the 68 generation, to go into the Labour Party to support his leadership bid so that he could become the next leader of the Labour Party. And lots of people did join Labour. Labour created a new cadre after the 68 generation, and we had to fight with Ben. I mean, Bennery, it sounds a ridiculous phrase, but Bennery was a political movement which was hostile to where we are. We wouldn't dream of discussing that in these terms now, but that's exactly what happened. And so Chris's paper had to deal with all this quite complicated ideological crisis, effectively. So holding the core paper together, but not returning to a sect. The important thing was to consolidate the political ideas in the early 1980s, at the same time always, however hard, have an outward-looking face. To be outward-looking, to intervene in any kind of struggle. I think the most important struggle that we did intervene in was the Falklands War. And Falklands was much, much harder to deal with than Iraq and Afghanistan has been for the last 10